presenting this event today about trauma-informed practice. Just to say, my name is Andrew Bates, and I am a forensic psychologist, and I work with the National Probation Service. And Kieran is. Sorry, Kieran, could you introduce yourself, Charles?
Yes, fine, Andrew, no problems. I'm Kieran McCartan. I'm a professor in criminology at the University of the West of England.
Thanks. So what happened last time? We gave this presentation, and it was very well attended. We're very pleased. 150 people came, which was really gratifying. But we thought we ran out of time a bit, and there was some sort of points made in the comments, and we wanted to be able to return to the subject for an hour today. Also, in between then and now, I had a couple of meetings with people who were at the event or heard about it, and they told me about some trauma-informed practice, which I thought was very good to know about. And I asked them both to come and speak today about their work as well. That's fortunately they're both here, which is very reassuring. That's Claire Barker and Lou Everett. So we're going to be hearing from Claire and Lou a bit later on. But meanwhile, and also we're going to be trying really ambitious today, and we are welcoming any other comments. If people have got things they want to say or share, please. I think the best way to do this is to raise your hand, because I can't see the comments bar. Well, I'll try and put the comments bar on. But you know, the idea today is to be more interactive and not just Kieran and I speaking. However, if I may, I'll get the ball rolling, Kieran, because I think, and this is really just stuff that came up last time. Some of it you may have comments on, some of it you may not. But I just thought we'd pay, big credit when people have made a point, and we would sort of pick up on it. First point was about the polygraph, which of course we've seen wide expansion of the use of the polygraph in certainly in the MPS we have, and it's more someone said, if find this way of working helpful in encouraging people to be safe enough to be fully open and honest. Now, I just wonder what your thoughts are on that, Kieran. I would say for myself, it's interesting. I'd not really associated the polygraph with trauma-informed practice, although I have had some recent experience whereby certainly people who commit sexual offences where the polygraph has definitely made a big impact at their, there's that term, isn't it, that the polygraph isn't so much a lie detector, but a truth facilitator. And I've seen that happen quite profoundly recently, where people who were being much more honest about their deviant sexual interest in a way that could then feed into their treatment and our response to them. Have you got any comments on that?
I think the challenge with the polygraph is how it's presented and what its purpose is. Traditionally the view of the polygraph was it was there to catch you out, and it was there to say you're being devious, you're not telling the truth, and we're on to you, and that's why it was being used. And there has been some examples, especially from some research in the US, that has sort of tried to take a strengths-based approach to the polygraph and said that it's there to facilitate, as you said, Andrew, the truth is there to support you in doing that. But I think from a trauma-informed perspective, the polygraph can be a bit of a challenge, because in talking to people about what they've done or what they've experienced, you run the risk of re-traumatizing them and getting them to repeat the stories over and over again. And if you're doing that in the context of a polygraph, and there's the indication that you may be lying or may not be being truthful about what you did or why you did it, that could be particularly problematic. and particularly re-traumatizing. So I think that while the struggle with the polygraph is, why are you using it? You're using it to facilitate truth telling and to allow people to say what they need to say and to give them cover in saying that, or is it to further incriminate them? And to me, the challenge of the polygraph comes in a trauma-informed way when we start to think about the therapeutic relationship and the engagement between the person asking the questions and the person answering the questions. And if the person who's facilitating the questioning and the conversation is effectively using the polygraph, then that's very different to someone using it as a blunt instrument. So I think the therapeutic relationship matters in this, and the polygraph is a tool within that process that can be used well or used poorly. But I think if we were going to go down a trauma-informed practice route and think about the polygraph, we would need to do a bit of work around why we're doing the polygraph, how people use the polygraph, and actually service users' understanding of the polygraph and what its purpose is. And I think that needs to be cleared up as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, what I've found is that in my experience, polygraph use by the administrators of it has sort of developed, and it used to be quite binary. You could find out if it said, "Have you been to Basingstoke this last week?" It would tell you yes or no. But there seemed to be the questioning is more subtle, and it is what seems to happen in the polygraph is that it is a sort of truth facilitator because it kind of gives permission for people to be more honest than they would probably had intended to be. But it's a strange one to start with because I suppose there's that tension between a trauma-informed approach, which, as we were saying last time, is was something where it's very much about sort of respecting the history and the experience of the individual. Yet at the same time, we are calling them to we are required to be monitor and control them. Sometimes in very profound ways, including returning to prison when they breach license conditions. So you've got that conflict, as I see it, and I think this came out last time, between how to be trauma informed while all the while knowing that you are operating in a correctional context. Now, Emma,
What I would just say, just to that, I think the polygraph argues a bigger question. The polygraph is the third rail in rehabilitation. It divides people like nothing else
yeah,
divides people. And people on both sides of the argument are firmly entrenched in their views around it. So I think that, part of this is there a time to reopen the conversation around the polygraph? Because 9 times out of 10, when you go to conferences or you have conversations with people, the polygraph becomes the dividing line. And then you never get past it. So it gets dropped. And then you end up having a conversation about something else.
funnily enough, I did suggest to my colleague, who is a polygrapher, that he did an insights talk on it, or either with me or without me, because it's such an interesting area, and it might be something coming for the future. But I think he understandably said it needed to be approved at various levels because of the way the polygraph is. I just know this is very much in my mind because I had a conversation only this week with a man who is on life license, who is in a nutshell, he'd been using pornography that wasn't really advisable, and the polygraph had illustrated this, and it brought him up really short, and he pledged to change his behaviour, and it seemed to reach the parts that other interventions could not reach, as the old advertising slogan goes. Emma Walgis, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, I also work as a healthy sex therapist in custody as well as my couple of days in the community. I guess I was just thinking about the sorts of things that we talk about on the Healthy Sex programme around sort of sexual fantasies and sexual interests and things that might be unhealthy for someone. And the amount of prep work that we do prior to really asking someone about that, in order, so we would do a lot of work with someone about dealing with perhaps feelings of shame that might get triggered by certain conversations, or how that might manifest in the therapeutic relationship. So we really focus on this idea of creating safety and alliance before we would then go on to that kind of subject. So I guess I really echo that idea that you said about, it's really about the relationship that person has with the person asking the questions and how safe they feel before launching into those questions.
Definitely, and like if you go back to like the six sort of pillars of trauma informed practice, safety and collaboration are core to that. And not only are you asking people challenging questions that they probably don't want to face up to, even if they recognize that there's an issue with their sex or sexuality, they probably don't want to talk about it with another person, never mind a court mandated person. So actually that safety and security has to be there. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything useful.
And it does seem that, the role of the polygrapher is much more than just wiring people up and asking the questions. It is to do with that rapport formed, and and that seems to me how it's evolved in a way which is actually helpful for the service user, that rapport is created. And in a nutshell, they say, look, it seems that they kind of say, I hadn't really wanted to tell you about this, but I'm now gonna tell you about it because you've built this rapport, and B, you've got this sort of machine that can tell whether I'm not telling the truth or not. So it's that's sort of that would be an interesting future area of consideration, sort of trauma informed polygraph practice. So thank you. I don't have a note who made the point, but thanks for that one. What I thought we might do now is move on to a guest speaker, if that's okay. So I'm mindful we've only got an hour, and I want to make sure people have their say. So, and if I could turn to Lou Everett, my colleague from Oxfordshire, because I had a conversation following the last event about the work of the CRC in Thames Valley and their working with women, and I was very interested to find out more about it. And of course, the very good news is within the month, we're all going to be one big happy family again in probation, and we're going to be able to share ideas more than we have been, which is all very good news. So, Lou, could I ask you, please? And I don't know if Helen, your colleague's here or not, but
she is.
Would you be able to just speak to us for sort of 5 minutes or so on that work that you've been doing and how it has been trauma informed? And I might ask some questions as we go along.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I'll start if that's okay, and then I'll ask Helen to come in terms of the nuts and bolts and things. So afternoon, everybody. My name's Lou Everett. I'm currently one of the heads of operations for Thames Valley CRC, but will be head of Oxfordshire PDU in a few weeks. And in Thames Valley CRC, we took the decision straight away that we wanted to have a cohort model, and one of those cohorts would be for female service users. And so within that cohort, we asked staff who might have an interest with working exclusively with women, and the model is that it would be staffed with female officers who would be holding caseloads of exclusively women who've offended. And that we would work in a different way with women, and that we would resource the work appropriately. And I think this is a critical piece that I wanted to get over today, really, which was about the resourcing of this work. Because what we found over time, and I'll hand over to Helen shortly to talk about the more specifics about this, but what we found over time was that to be genuinely working towards being trauma informed or trauma responsive, that there was a significant need to immerse the staff in that way of working. You can't do that with large caseloads. You can't do that with without significant support in terms of management, in terms of how your team meetings are structured, in terms of how much reflective practice you build into your model, and the kind of constant questioning of your practice around how your response to that particular woman is appropriate, and whether it's boundaried, and whether it's collusive, or whether it's or where your own stuff is playing into that. And it's not an easy thing to do. It's not easy work to do. I think you also have to recognise the cost of working with trauma on staff. I mean, I think Kieran, when we last talked, spoke very clearly and articulately about working with people's trauma is traumatizing in itself, and therefore what do you do with that, and how do you support staff through that? And again, that's not an inexpensive thing to do in terms of your resources, in terms of your time. So I think that was the something that we felt very strongly that we wanted to invest in that, and we did do so. And I think at this point I'd really like to introduce Helen Morris. So Helen is the senior probation officer, but she's got the strategic lead for women, and she really is the driving force and architect behind how we've constructed our work in Thames Valley. So Helen, over to you.
Thanks, Lou. Hi everyone. As Lou said, I'm Helen Morris, the SPO in the Thames Valley CRC, and have had the lead for women since the commencement, really, of the women's cohort. So we're talking 5 or 6 years now. And I think since the beginning, really, we've talked about being trauma informed, which over time has progressed to us focusing on being trauma responsive. And I think when we had a conversation last week, we were talking about that being an ongoing process, and I definitely think that that's something which we acknowledge. But I think that we also acknowledge the huge progress that I'd like to think we've made in terms of kind of embedding that practice almost in a kind of unconscious fashion in terms of the way in which we work with women, which I think the very principle and framework around the women's cohort has allowed us to do. So I think operationally, we started fairly early on with a core intervention that was trauma informed, and the whole team being trained on that, to not necessarily deliver it, because it's very much about, as Lou pointed out, the impact on the team in terms of the trauma and how you deal with that means that you need to be in the right place to deliver that. But what that intervention training did was give the team the kind of core tools around key principles about being trauma informed and the way in which we can work with women, which I think even by that early stage was very much needed in terms of what was apparent by working with a team of a caseload of women, and the complexities that those women present and the needs that those women present and the different way of working as a result of that. So I think over time we've looked at kind of embedding those core principles in everything we do. And I think one of the biggest learning points we've had has been around the kind of sympathy-empathy balance when working with women, and what that means in terms of our roles and the carrying out the order of the court, but also dealing with and working with women in a different way, ultimately being trauma responsive. And I think that was something that has taken us a while to bottom out and get our heads around, in terms of the need, despite being highly traumatized in a number of the women that we work with, the need for those boundaries and the need for the safety in those boundaries is really important, as Kieran alluded to earlier. And so I think that's what we've been, we work to very well, and we're very much continuously being thoughtful around what that means for the woman in terms of her engagement, asking why is the non-engagement, is that willful or not, is a question we ask frequently all the time. And I know that's something we do generally in our work, but there's a kind of almost a different aspect to that when working with women and with a trauma-informed approach. And I think that we've sought to kind of develop that that thinking and keep that thinking amongst the team in not just a kind of a tick box training exercise. And I think that's been a core thing for us. It wasn't kind of completing that training at the beginning and then we ticked that box and then we were trauma informed and responsive. It's been and will be a continuous learning exercise. And I think it's also highlighting those areas of practice that are kind of, in some sense is similar to your beginning conversation. An example of this is around kind of street sex workers. I think that we've almost discovered a whole new cohort of women in line with the change in sentencing, where we're working with a lot of the street sex workers that we work with got less than 12 months and have spent years in that cycle with nothing to do with probation. And TR and the change in sentencing meant that we got this whole new cohort of women. And that's a whole new sensitivity around how that's talked about with women. Are we re-traumatizing and what do we need to learn about the vulnerabilities? And so we've tried to, amongst the development of the team, infiltrate kind of training from outside around that to give the team confidence in challenging those things in a trauma responsive way. And I think in line with that as well, we've also tried to more recently put something in place around clinical supervision, which again was mentioned and touched on earlier, around the acknowledgement that the team of practitioners who are working with women on a daily basis are also listening to this trauma all day long, every day. And I think the importance of supporting them where possible, which so far has been group clinical supervision. And I think that the focus of that, which has been well defined around what impact does working with these women have on you, and an ability to share that in a comfortable, safe environment, which importantly wasn't shared with me. And I think that was important in terms of the safety of that group. But I think it's really acknowledging, and in my view is something that we need to spread out further to all practitioners. But it's certainly something around working all with women and the trauma that they regularly tell their officers a lot about. There's a need to ensure that those officers are well as well. And I think that we've learnt that more and more. So yeah, I think that we've come to a really good place around that, the kind of core principles that we implement in our practice anyway, around kind of listening and responding and understanding. But doing that with the benefit of a whole caseload of women has meant that we've had to deal with that in a slightly different way. And I think the most important thing, as I've already said, though, is the kind of continuation of that learning. We're not there yet. We haven't nailed it. And I think that it's important to be aware of that. But I think we have got to a really good place where just in my general conversations with staff, I acknowledge how they are working in a trauma-informed way. And we've had an interesting conversation last week around how you measure that. And that has got me thinking, I think, how you measure how are you trauma-informed is a really interesting question. And I think that we're, looking at various things around enforcement. And I think that that's a worthy discussion and something to move forward in. But I think, I'm very proud of the women's team in Thames Valley CRC and the work that they've done and the way that they conduct that day in, day out with obvious restrictions that, not everything can be trauma informed. We've had good conversations around environments. There's lots of things that we would like to do differently and do more of. But I think in terms of our conduct and our contact with women, we've certainly progressed, I think, significantly in terms of how we used to work with women.
Thanks very much, Helen and Lou. I've just got a couple of questions. I mean, I guess to Lou as the senior manager, I mean, how easy was it to ring fence the more intensive staff input? Is that not always a challenge? People saying, well, we'd like to do this, but we've got umpteen other things to do. I mean, how was your experience with that?
That was difficult, and I think initially we started off with two smaller ring fence cohorts. So we had the 18 to 25s and the women, and when it became obvious that actually as a smaller organisation, post TR, the resourcing of all of those and keeping all of those sufficiently resourced was problematic. So we in the end we had to pick one, and we stuck with women because we believed it was important to do so. Not that it's not important to work with 18 to 25s in a different way, as we're seeing increasingly now. And I think it's not always easy, because if you've got a very small team that is working with a smaller caseload, that is working in quite a different way, it's not very easy to move staff around. So the minute there is a vacancy or a period of sickness or maternity leave even or something, that's quite difficult to cover. So it has been a juggling act, and sometimes we've had feast and famine periods, definitely, but we've always tried to maintain that lower caseload for that group. It's not always been possible, and that feeds into Helen's point about, you know, what we can achieve and what we can't achieve all the time.
Kieran, you wanted to make a point?
Yeah, I really wanted to sort of ask Helen a couple of questions, and maybe Luke can come in as well, about that sort of empathy, sympathy boundary, because, you know, like, one of the challenges from a criminal justice perspective is, you know, this isn't like health where the primary person you're harming is yourself. You're in the criminal justice system because you've harmed someone else in some way. So did you see, or was it a challenge working in a trauma-informed way, depending upon A, the trauma that the female perpetrators had experienced in their own life, and B, what sort of offence that they had committed? Did either of those two things shift staff in the way that they engage with them? So were you able to say, actually, it was much more straightforward to get that message across, and it was a low-level drugs offence, but actually if we were working with a female domestic violence perpetrator, that was much harder to get across? It was easier to create trauma-informed practice if the lady in question had also been the victim of a serious assault or something else had happened. Did you find any of that complexity in your working?
If I'm honest, I don't think we did. I think that it's, for me, the key part has been around the kind of understanding of that trauma. So whatever that trauma may be, and using that context as a clear understanding as to how that person's arrived, which I think is a core of what we've all been trained to do and we've all been doing for a number of years. But I think there's something, you know, I think, for example, that the street sex workers, who is definitely the new cohort of women that, you know, for the last 5 years, we've really had to get to grips with, you know, when you truly understand what those women are going through on a daily basis, you know, that understanding around why they haven't got to the appointment or why they haven't picked up the phone becomes greater. And then that links into, well, you know, we don't know where they are, so we're going to have to do something enforcement wise about it, because that's the court order or that's the prison sentence. But it then links into what we might suggest or propose, or what we might do in the interim to try and get them to engage. And I think that forms a core part of how we work. You know, it's that thinking around, well, we're going to follow the process because that's what our job is to do, and that's why we do it. And they know, they've signed up to that, they understand what needs to happen. But at the same time, we need to think about what can we do differently, what other things will engage them. And I think it's that, for me, with women, definitely, and that trauma link, it's about those complexities. We can't even begin to work with many of our women on their offending behaviour, which is intrinsically linked to their complexities, until we've helped them with some of those things. And sometimes that's signposting and embedding in the community if we're lucky, and sometimes that's practitioners having to very frequently do that themselves. But it's those key things that it's just the why, it's getting to the core understanding of the need. And I think almost it's just the understanding of what the trauma is. And to some extent, that's the breakthrough moment for the women. Certainly, that's what we found with the intervention that we did. I think there's some nervousness around a trauma-informed intervention, and is that meant to be therapeutic? And it was very clear that it's psychoeducational, and actually it really did provide, or does provide, that kind of clear light bulb moment of, oh, so I'm not crazy. This is why I'm behaving, you know, that I've got a normal response to an abnormal situation. And then now I can, so it's just that intervention is about realizing that. And I think that training for the staff helped them to progress that with the women. And then, you know, we're not trained, we're not therapists, we're not trying to deal with that trauma, but we can help them move to a place where they can manage better day to day and move to a place where they can deal with that trauma in a more constructive, positive way when they're in a place to do so.
Lou and Helen, can you see There's been a couple of questions. Can you see
Yeah.
them?
I'll take the first one about caseloads. So in Thames Valley CRC, we don't use a workload management tool. We have a kind of approximate number of cases that we like to work to. But I just did some maths over there to try and work out. So we would say we would be giving staff about a 25% reduction. So we'd be expecting women to staff to hold a 75% caseload. That would be where people would be out on the workload management tool if we had a workload management tool, if that makes sense. So ordinarily we would say around about 55 cases would be okay. So therefore we would say for someone in the women's caseload, ideally in the women's team, it would be about 40. But as I said before, our ability to always hold to that is dependent on so many factors. So that's the aspiration. And we do sometimes get there.
And I think just picking up on what Kieran said earlier, we've got this age-old thing here, really, of the joint presence of risk and need in our client group, haven't we? And I don't know whether, I mean, thanks very much for that. I think we'll need to move on to another area. But I suppose I'm just thinking, with the women client group, was there? Do you think there is the facility to focus, the facility or indeed need to focus more on their need than their risk? I suppose that what I'm kind of saying was it this the reason why the female cohort was kind of identified for this approach? I don't know if that, if you know what I mean.
I don't think so, because I think we're working in the CRC, so therefore none of our cases are any more than medium risk of serious harm, and we have women that we work with are on the cusp of being high risk of serious harm. So I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. I think it was partly a response to the Corsten report and wanting to have a real response to that, because I think at the time of the CRC's formation, where we Corsten 10 years on and not an awful lot of change, so I think there was a real desire to do that. And I think also a recognition that for that particular group, although now we're seeing it as a more widespread recognition, that trauma actually underpins an awful lot of people's behaviour and trauma. So, but I don't think that ACEs and things like that were quite to the forefront of people thinking 6 years ago or 7 years ago when we started that work. But I think it was probably just more obvious about the role that trauma played in the development of women's offending, which is why it made it the obvious candidate. I'm not sure whether you would have anything further on that, Helen?
Mm-hmm.
No, yeah, I'd agree. But I also think that need leads to risk, doesn't it? And I think, again, a bit like the complexities conversation, if you manage those complexities, if you think about the way in which they, handle that trauma in a different way than we have before and be more responsive, that, in my experience, serves to lower that risk ultimately. So I think that it is intrinsically linked, but I think probably there's a greater focus on that for women than might be comfortable. But my view, I haven't worked with high risk women or men for some time, but I would suggest that would be no different for high risk women. But I'll find out soon.
Okay, thanks. Kieran, do you want to make a final point on this?
Yeah, it's just a practical question. There'll be people here, Lou and Helen, who are thinking, well, how can I work in a trauma-informed way? How can I get either my probation team to think about it, or how can I get the CRC that I'm working with to think about it? What would be your one takeaway each for them? What is the most significant thing you think in getting the ball rolling?
I would say that the training and awareness raising around trauma, adverse childhood experiences, how that impacts on people and impacts on people's behaviour would be step one. But I would also say that the space to reflect and have conversations with people about your approaches with people and really kind of dig into your own the work with someone and checking those balances around risk and needs and checking those balances around sympathy and empathy. And I don't think that you can do that in isolation. So you need to have people around you who are working in the same way and wanting to work in the same way, because it's an iterative process and it's an ongoing conversation. I think that would be my thoughts on that. Bless you, Andrew.
Sorry, thanks. There's a question from Angela Orty.
Sorry, I'm the National Probation Service, Women's Strategic Lead for South West, South Central, although there is now someone interim for South Central. Just to say that we now have a Becoming Trauma-Informed workshop that's available on the newly qualified officers package, so that every newly qualified officer will, as part of their programme, will undertake to do this workshop so that they all actually have some understanding around the impact of trauma. And that's really was written by myself and some other SPOs in the women's team to really support that cultural shift, to encourage that sort of really curious approach, that having that reflective lens when working with trauma, you know, around safety, do no harm, those sort of core principles. So it is something which I am hoping will support that sort of cultural shift in our organisation. I mean, it has also been rolled out across both divisions. You know, for staff to come on to. The focus was on sort of court staff initially, but it now is part of that programme to support, as I said, that cultural shift. So here's hoping that that does something and works.
And so there's questions from people about whether what you're referring to is national or regional or divisional.
No, it's national. It's part of the national NQO programme now that they, you know, newly qualified officers undertake. So every region has a strategic women's lead like myself. We've all been working with our qualified, you know, our QDO teams, the quality development team, sorry, using an acronym, you know, to make sure that this is rolled out. I've rolled out already in South Central and South West, and we're about to do our second one. So every cohort will be given this workshop.
But also, this is a very good example of where initiatives from the CRC and the MP, you know, are going to be combined, or might be combined in the future for where, you know, innovative ideas drawing from these different sources, which will be able to benefit from each other. That's great. Thank you very much for that. I just wanted to make a sort of linked point from my list of comments previously. Again, someone said, I feel like the service has made huge advances with regards to PD pathways, which indeed is, you know, a key element of the PD pathways approach is the focus on formulation as relating to an individual's past and their current behavior, and indeed the significance of trauma and adverse childhood experiences in how they fit into formulations is a key part of that. Question: is there going to be any kind of a trauma-informed hub? I'm not. I suppose what we've been talking about is some different examples of trauma-informed practice. I'm not aware of a hub as such. I don't know if anyone else is, but I suppose what we're seeing here is some the strands of trauma-informed practice, how they're impacting in various aspects of our work, including the PD pathways, which is, of course, you know, substantially funded, and you know, there's significant input from psychologists and other staff employed by health to support probation staff in working with this client group. So that's great. Thanks very much. I've got some other comments about courts. I just thought I'd mention these if I may. That essentially the issue of potential trauma-informed practice in courts, although the acknowledgement that time and pressure from other agencies is a big factor, which of course it is, and many other agencies, including the judiciary and solicitors and lawyers and that kind of thing. We have to be really assertive and with organisational backing for frontline practitioners to work in a trauma-informed way in courts. Someone else said, I think getting that good start in the court situation is very important, but very hard to do sometimes. As a court PO, I find that sometimes we are seen as a more understanding face of the court system. There is an opportunity to start off on a good foot for someone if we get that initial contact right. Conducting an interview in a court building and the psychological impact is certainly a fact to be aware of, though. Now, I don't know if Felicity Sparshot is on the line. She may not be, but Felicity was going to...
Yes, I am, Andrew.
Oh, you are here, Felicity, are you?
Yep.
Great. So it's a bit like a seance, this, although I can see some people, but calling out, is anyone there, and expecting them to knock in response. But Felicity, if you would you be able to speak about the CSTR initiative that you and I have both been involved with, just for a moment, and how that just might address some of those issues that court staff raised about working in a trauma-informed way?
Yes, of course. The CSTR is an acronym that we all love, an acronym, don't we? But it stands for Community Sentence Treatment Requirements. So it's how we are referring to mental health treatment requirements, alcohol treatment requirements, and drug rehabilitation requirements. There's a national rollout of this CSTR programme. Milton Keynes, which is a court that I cover, was the blueprint for the CSTR, being the first site in the country, and really is around pulling together all the partner agencies to work together, making sure that we are assessing safely and confidently and quickly the young people in some areas, but for Milton Keynes it's available to anybody. Some areas are focusing on young people, some focusing on female offenders. For us, it's anybody in the Milton Keynes area. And so when that person attends for their pre-sentence report, we will then identify that they have a treatment need and use very careful discussion and assessments with them through our partner agencies, using that sort of trauma-informed approach, particularly around the mental health treatment. So these don't have to be people that would be more suited to a secondary care mental health treatment, but people who are suffering from anxiety, from trauma, from depression. But those issues are making it difficult for them to be able to engage with services and know how to interact with services for their best support. So we use a trauma-informed approach to be able to conduct those PSR interviews and then to be able to pass on to our partner agencies who, because of the CSTR, we're very much linked in and able to access straight away for immediate assessment as well. They use a trauma-informed approach to their assessment, and we're able to then correctly target what the needs are for that individual so that they're not being sentenced to something that actually is setting them up to fail, because the trauma that they're suffering, the anxiety that they're feeling, is going to prevent them from being able to take that first step into attending an appointment. We benefit very much from having a link worker support role in that as well, which is provided at the moment through a third party charitable organisation that we fund through health services. But that person then can do some real motivation and that practical support to be able to help that person engage and attend treatment, so that we find that we have a much better success rate in terms of people engaging, far fewer breaches, and people actually making really good progress. So as the order is continuing, there are regular reviews at the court, so the court can see that the intervention is targeting the right needs for that person, and that they are then much less likely to be back in front of the courts, and therefore avoiding short-term custodial sentences because they've almost burned their bridges by failing to attend on previous community orders. So that sort of trauma-informed approach really helps to identify the correct needs for them. Angela, I saw you had your hand up. Is that for me?
Yes. Okay, so the MOJ are at the moment, I've been in lots of meetings with them around scoping out for problem-solving courts, which we know we have in Manchester, and have they touched base with you, Felicity? Because this would seem to align really well. And I know we're doing some work and we've got projects going like Court Up in Bristol, which they've expressed interest in. But I'm just wondering whether you're working with them at the moment to look at potential this being a site, because it would seem really well aligned to that for a problem-solving court.
Yes, we did do some work. I forget the name of the lady now that we were working with, but we'd done some work with her. She came with us to visit Aylesbury Crown Court. So the magistrates this works out of is Milton Keynes magistrates, but of course some of those cases get transferred to the Crown. And so she came with us to assess the reviews that take place at the Crown Court. She wasn't able to do the same piece of work in the same way at Milton Keynes because they didn't have what was specifically labelled a problem-solving court. But we were able to use our experience of CSTR and the review process, and particularly at the Crown Court, the review process, because that very much fitted in with actually what she was trying to deliver in terms of problem-solving courts. So she took some feedback from that with her.
And because what we know is the tensions, isn't it, around the judiciary and their lack of, I guess, training, because they get one day a year, and understanding. And whilst we've had a lot of support around the women's agenda in the bench's sort of guide handbook, did your magistrates and judges receive specific training or input around that more trauma-informed and responsive approach?
They did. So I did some awareness briefings with our local judiciary around a trauma-informed approach, what they could expect, what they might see in their pre-sentence reports, what they might see in terms of what was being delivered orally as an oral report or an update. But with the CSTR as well, we are very, very fortunate. That has to for it to work successfully, it has to be full partnership working. So we're very much fortunate that we have not only our health and our substance misuse providers as part of that, but we have representation from the magistrates and from legal advisors as well. So everybody's very much working together towards doing that. And therefore, they then take back themselves that the benefits of what they hear in the steering group meetings that they attend. It's a forum for them to be able to say, well, actually, we weren't sure about this. What does this mean? And for us to either be able to explain them to pass on what some of that meant, or for us to know that, right, that's an area of need. So let's put together a session. And even just a couple of months ago, we did some more briefing sessions over Teams for them because they've had new magistrates coming in that wouldn't have been as aware. So having the judiciary as part of the steering group has been a huge success.
And indeed, Felicity, I think the idea that there are more pilot projects for the CST, aren't there? And they're increasing all the time, although there are questions of how they might be funded, bedded into kind of business as usual for clinical commissioning groups. I think that because how we're going to move from small number of pilots to this being provided more widely across the country. And indeed, I know Dorothy's still here, but my old friend Ken Elliott, who was on the call, was involved in the origins of that initiative, as was I, which is so it's really good to see how it's been developing. Kieran, do you want to make a point just before we move on to Claire, who's been waiting very patiently to speak about her project?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think it's very welcoming, Felicity, that there's the range and the nuance of trauma is being talked about, because what's traumatic for one person isn't necessarily traumatic for someone else. And when you say trauma, we always go to the worst place in our head, don't we? But it's also how you respond to that. I suppose my question for you would be, were there any challenges around doing this? Because historically, the courts are very black and white. We've always heard this debate about the relationship between psychology and the courts and psychologists in the courtroom. And actually, this is even further down that path. There's more well-being to a certain degree. So actually, did you find that the nuance went down well within a court setting, or that there was a bit of, I wouldn't say pushback, but a bit of struggle with some of that?
I think that was where the promotion of the CSTR really came to the fore, because it was, MHTRs, for example, very underused, but have been available for years and years and years. And so I think if we were to have started just saying there's more MHTR proposals that the court was seeing coming through, there'd be a level of dubious nature around how they would be received, particularly when traditional MHTRs would be looking at secondary care, and we're talking about primary care being the most need. So the education to the court was really important, and that's where having them as part of our steering group was also very important, but to keep that education going and also to extend that to defence solicitors as well, so that defence solicitors would perhaps highlight some cases to us as well when they were dealing with them. They thought to themselves, actually, this person might be a good candidate. I've had this person come in to, I've been representing this person 2 or 3 times recently. How about somebody looks at this? So getting all the sort of HMCTS partner agencies on board prevented that. The courts sometimes are quite black and white about looking at breaches and reviews, and if they see a number of failed attendances, wanting to know why that person hasn't breached, why were these made acceptable. So some of those things would be discussed in the steering group meeting around practicalities of actually somebody who is suffering this much needs that support before they're fully able to engage. So we might expect them to fail initially, but actually if we can show that they maybe are not attending this appointment, but we've got this link worker who's helping them and motivating them to come to something else, and then they start to engage properly, they haven't dropped out of contact, they just need that leg up to say, actually, this is really worthwhile for you, and come on, you can do it. And then once they've engaged, that problem normally disappears, and therefore the court are not seeing the breaches coming through and wondering why on earth the person wasn't breached several months ago.
And I just want to quickly add to that before Andrew kicks me off. It's that I completely agree with that, and what we're needing to see now is how we facilitate safe spaces for harm reduction, and in terms of offending, where spaces where people have opportunities to seek help and opportunities to fail at a lower level, and that actually you're not being breached and you're not being recalled. And that's a bit of a challenge. It's easier in a health perspective because harm reduction looks very different, but harm reduction in an offending scenario could still end up with someone committing an offence against someone else. So it's a more challenging concept and needs a bit more thinking around it.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Evan. And the timing's perfect. My coordination has been magnificent, because we're now, in the last 5 minutes, we're going to hear from Claire, who I had a very interesting and productive conversation with about area of work she's been involved in, which is very much reflecting trauma-informed practice, but here more from the point of view of the victim. So a fitting sort of a way to end the presentation today. So Claire, over to you, please. Please tell us more about the work you've been involved in recently.
Yeah, so I'm Claire Barker. I'm a forensic psychologist, and I currently work for the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. And I'll give you a little summary of what the inquiry is about, because not everybody has heard of us. So the inquiry was set up in 2015 off the back of the allegations initially against Jimmy Savile, and it was initially set up to investigate why abuse may have been alleged in historical circumstances where no action was taken, and safeguarding measures were not followed, and people essentially in positions of authority got away with sexual abuse of children. The inquiry is now split into 3 strands. So we have an investigation strand, and if anyone wants to visit our website, you can see some of our published reports from the investigations that we've held. But we have investigated various different institutions, such as residential schools, the Anglican Church, Lambeth Council, and the social care provided to children. And you can see that we have published different reports, having heard from witnesses and victims within each of those contexts, making recommendations for how changes need to be made to safeguard children in future. And there have been changes in policies, procedures, and even in law to reflect some of those recommendations. We also have a research strand, which is about understanding the impact of child sexual abuse, understanding why some people may not report or act on suspicions of sexual abuse, and various other areas that we've done a bit of a deeper dig into the views of people that are affected in this area. And then the area that I mainly work in is the Truth Project. So the Truth Project was set up to allow victims and survivors to come forward and share their experience of their abuse in whatever form they want and in however much detail they want, with someone to bear witness to that event and to just listen and hold that event for them, and to give them the opportunity to identify the failings as they see them and to make their own recommendations for how safeguards can be improved and we can protect children in future. And all of these accounts will get fed into our final report at the end of the inquiry, into the recommendations that we make for changes in policy and procedure and safeguarding. Since the beginning of the inquiry, the inquiry started with one psychologist who was frantically attempting to put in place a trauma-informed approach for the victims and survivors that we engage with. And we're now 6 years later, and I think we've seen some real success as to how that approach has evolved over that period of time. We have everybody within our organisation trained in a trauma-informed approach, from the person that might answer the phone to the person that's actually facilitating that session to the managers that are holding the booking system. It's embedded across the whole of the service, and it's something that we are all regularly talking about. We also have a huge recognition that in order to be trauma-informed, we have to be participant-led. So we focus very much on what is it that the individual wants to share with us. We don't probe, we don't ask lots of questions. We allow them to come to a session and tell us what they want. And for some people, they want to talk about their experience of abuse. For some people, they just want to say, it happened and this is what needs to be different. And so we're very focused on letting them have their own individual session and share their own experience. We also set those up in a way that is very led by the individual. So even down to whether they want male or female facilitators, have they got any preferences for things that should or shouldn't be in the room? Is there anything we can provide that would be of comfort to them on the day of their session? We allow them to bring support. We also provide support workers. One of the terms of reference for the inquiry, which fits very well with a trauma-informed approach, is that we will do no harm. So anyone that comes to share with us, the aim is always that we will manage that in a way that will not be re-traumatizing and we will not do harm, so they do not leave their engagement with the inquiry being worse off than when they came to us. So we have a support model where people can opt in to one-to-one sessions with a trained support worker, and we use that to sort of manage the triggers and identify what could be difficult and how can we help you to engage in a way that's safe. And the feedback that we've had is really positive. We're 6 years later, and in Truth specifically, we've heard from over 6,000 participants in England who experienced historical sexual abuse in England and Wales. And we've had some really positive, people come back to us. A lot of people join our forum, which is for people that want to sort of hear about our events or share their views on the inquiry. And a lot of the feedback that we get is really positive about how safely managed they found that experience and how in control of that experience they felt they were. We've also managed to reach out to some smaller groups or populations of people. So we have a deaf project. We've engaged with BAME populations. We've done a prison project, so we've actually heard from lots of prisoners who have their own experiences of historical trauma and have wanted to share that with us and have their voice heard. And at the moment, I've actually got the task, as we speak, of researching some of our feedback and thinking about how well did that trauma-informed approach work across the organisation, and what could we recommend for future inquiries, because an inquiry is time limited, we will come to an end. What can we recommend for future inquiries that they could use, because we're quite unique in having adopted one in our service compared to many others. Sorry, Andrew, I think you're on mute.
Andrew, you're on mute.
Well, I knew it would get me in the end, your mute button. Thank you very much, Claire. You know, it's very interesting and helpful to hear about that. And again, seeing how trauma-informed practice very much, you know, from the victim's point of view. But I'm particularly interested in what you're saying about how, you know, to avoid re-victimizing people by asking to kind of repeat their story or repeat what happened to them, but the respect that they're held in there, that's really positive. And you and I have also had a discussion about how the work I've been involved in with restorative justice and the voice of the victim being so important, which I spoke about in a similar talk last year. We're out of time now, everyone, but I think it's been there's one final point. Carla, you got 30 seconds if you want to say something. Sorry to put
Thank you, Andrew. I just wanted to let you know that the design faculty, which I've just become a part of, the learning design faculty, they are in the process of, we are in the process of designing a standalone trauma-informed product for all staff nationally. And we're also thinking about how we can theme trauma throughout all of our learning products as well. So we will be sort of coming to those experts sort of around the various offices nationally to think about how we can do this in the best way, and, you know, maybe sort of start off with sort of being trauma informed and then look at how we can be trauma responsive, as some of the other people have mentioned. So I just wanted to let everyone know, because I would imagine there's lots of expertise in the room, in the virtual room.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Connor. Yes, and you and I have spoken on this subject before. I'm pleased to see that's been developing. So thank you, everyone, for coming along. And I think, you know, we've had some, it's been really good to follow up Kieran and my initial speech talk with these sort of examples of practice. I should say that if you want to email us or put us in the chat for future recommendations, you know, we can try and respond to that, because Kieran and I have been very pleased to sort of get the ball rolling and then have this kind of discussion, which is possible in this working in this virtual way. So please get in touch with us if you want anything that you think we might follow up on, because then we can speak to the Insights team about future events if possible. But I'm mindful that people's and thank you if you have been giving up your lunch hour and for coming to share this experience with us. And by the way, our next one I think is in a fortnight's time. I can't remember which one it's about, Kieran, that one, but it's all on the Insights website. Please join us for future events. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Nice to see you.